It's Friday, December 19th, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Herms. Today is what's supposed to be the official release of all of the Epstein files the Department of Justice has in its possession. They had the last month to redact, to remove, to protect, or potentially scrub certain names or information out of these files, but it's directed and mandated by Congress that these things get released. And this has been a long time coming. And because of this, it's why I had this initial conversation a few weeks ago with Alex Hinton. He is the Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at Rutgers, the Director of the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights, as well as the UNESCO Chair on Genocide Prevention. And he is one of the foremost people looking at the MAGA movement as sort of an anthropological oddity, how to understand how this political movement works and why it's different from what we've seen in the past. And so we talk all about what those differences are and what the release of the Epstein files, which have been so central to this movement, will mean for these voters. And spoilers here, it might not mean a lot, but it also could mean a lot. And that's sort of the back and forth that Alex and I have. It's a really, really fantastic conversation. Before we get to that, make sure that you're following or subscribe to the show wherever you listen to it or watch it. Hit the like button as well if you're a watcher on YouTube. Leave a review and a comment. It really helps boost the show on whatever platform you're listening to it on. Become a paid subscriber to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I just released this week a brand new Things You Forgot from Civics class newsletter all about what does it mean to be a citizen and who gets to be one and how do we decide that? Because there's been a lot of talk lately about those exact things. But that's just for paid subscribers. Subscriptions start at just $5 a month. Annual subscriptions are 20% off right now from that monthly price for $50 a year, and founding members are making the most sense members. You get your price locked in for life, no matter how much subscriptions go up in the future. And as always, share the show on social media. It's MIMS Newspod. That's MIMS Newspod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on Twitter and Blue Sky, and at Grant_Herms on everything else. All right, let's get to my conversation with Alex Hinton. Give the gift of luxury this holiday season with Cozy Earth. Picture it, a quiet holiday morning, everyone together wrapped in warmth, laughter, and that perfect kind of cozy that you just wish you could bottle all the time. Well, a silent night starts with the right sheets, and Cozy Earth's bamboo sheets are the ultimate gift. It's everyday luxury elevated, the kind of comfort that turns every night into a serene escape no matter how much clatter arises. Plus, every sheet has a 100-day sleep trial and a 10-year warranty. You really cannot go wrong. And don't forget about the pajamas for those holiday mornings. The women's stretch knit and the men's bamboo sets are made for those slow, snuggly holiday moments at home. Visit CozyEarth.com and use my exclusive 40% off code MIMS25, that's MIMS25, to get 40% off your entire order this holiday season. And if you get a post-purchase survey, make sure you heard about Cozy Earth from Make It Make Sense. We get a cut of that money, so you're helping us, and you get to stay warm this holiday season. Wrap the ones you love in luxury with Cozy Earth. All right, let's get back to the show. But Alex, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
I think we should start here because from a 30,000 foot broad angle kind of a place. Because the way that you approach this as a cultural anthropologist, I think, is different than how people like me, a political journalist, approach the MAGA movement. So how do you look at MAGA? How do you define it? A lot of people bandied the word about, is it a political party at this point? Has it completely taken over the Republican Party? Is it a cult? Is it something little less defined like Antifa? Like, what is it?
Yeah, that's a great question. As an anthropologist, and I wear a number of hats. I work in, political conflict, political violence, a bunch of stuff. And so one thing that cuts through that is the notion of a social movement. So in anthropology, we talk about sometimes revitalization movements. And in this, we could go back, for example, to some Native American groups or groups in New Guinea. People say this all over the world. The Nazis could be looked at as a revitalization movement. They're not rare in history, and it's, there are all sorts of different types of society. But the sort of, as it sounds, the idea is that you have a society that's under stress, or at least there's perceived stress, high levels of anxiety, anomie, or sort of, a loss of meaning, a desire to have things get better. And in those situations, to really get it going, you have to have a charismatic leader. I work on, for example, as you can tell, one of my domains of study is genocide and Holocaust studies, and I worked in Cambodia. And, you can look at the Khmer Rouge, who oversaw a genocide there, as a revitalization movement. I don't mean to say that there's a parallel between, Nazis and the Khmer Rouge and the MAGA movement. It's just what I study. And so that's why I'm drawing on those examples. But, often there's a charismatic leader, and through the sort of will, the charisma of that person, everyone feels like they're being uplifted. Typically, there's an organization that's linked to that individual. It becomes institutionalized. But often at this point, once you lose a charismatic leader, that's it for the movement. And that's what I expect to happen with MAGA. And then once Donald Trump is gone, he's retired, what have you, I think the movement will be sort of like the Tea Party. It'll fade away. It'll still be there in some sense. But yeah, so in short, there's sort of a beginning and an ending. But, I could elaborate on some of the particular dimensions, if you want, of the,
Yeah.
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 So
I think so. Because I think we want to get to like what happens in a post-Trump MAGA, I think, at the end of this. But it does feel like we are inching toward that. But when I think about the pieces and the parts that make up what MAGA is, it feels sort of cobbled together in a way. A few weeks ago, I had on a fashion writer to talk about MAGA fashion and how that talks to us about the factions that are within MAGA. And they don't really mesh together apart from under the umbrella that is the man of Donald Trump. But as an anthropologist, what are your pillars or buckets or factions or whatever we want to call them?
yeah, that's a great question. So I think it begins, and ends with Trump in one sense, but you also have the idea of MAGA itself, which is a message that is a revitalization message. And you can put all sorts of different groups and ideas under that label. So when you think about MAGA, I tend to think of it as having Trump, and there are some different pillars. For example, I listened that you alluded to before. These are actually, where do you find stuff as an anthropologist? Well, you wait and see what the people who are part of it say. And so the stuff that I'd heard in different contexts, but there was a interview that Tucker Carlson was doing with Marjorie Taylor Greene. And at the beginning, Tucker Carlson for a long time went through the principles of MAGA. And, they're not that surprising, and they all tie back into the idea of revitalization. First and foremost, you have the idea of America first. Right. And that slogan has been used, of course, historically and goes back. But, just as messaging, MAGA is brilliant messaging, right? Because it's crystal clear. It's simple to hang on to. If we go back to the election, I would ask people, what is the message with Harris? And not a single person I talked to could name anything. They would talk about a policy, what have you. So that's crystal clear. America first, MAGA. The second thing, again, no surprise, but it's borders, right? You prioritize the people in the country. You don't want, quote unquote, invaders coming back across the border. So you got to secure your borders, secure the country. So it's sort of a security message. The third thing is, again, in terms of the economy, there's a animus, a dislike of globalization and sort of high level finance, service industry, and this desire to return manufacturing, go back, get working class jobs. And so it's anti-globalist, if you will. And that anti-globalism extends to other things like the WHO and foreign policy. That's sort of a separate line of discussion. Another thing, and we see this playing out in interesting ways in the Trump administration, wars. Forget it. there's no going to war. You don't lose people's lives. If something is really, really important, that might be, a case where the national interest, America first, was threatened. Then it might be a time for war. So you get, like with the bombing of Iran, even in the Middle East, and also Trump gets a lot of slack for, trying to get his Nobel Prize through all his peace initiatives. And it's like, well, pay attention to the America First stuff at home. And then the last thing is, that they mentioned, he said free speech, which is fine. And I think that's really important in MAGA, in part because of their perception that during the Biden administration, they were suppressed, and their free speech was curtailed. But I tend to think of it, just this was, my add-in. If I go to MAGA events, you always see we the people. So there's this populist dimension of we the people. You see it over and over again, from the Constitution. But it's like populism. It's the people. And that's really important because who is opposed to the people? It could be foreign invaders, could be Chinese, but it's actually the elites. And once you get to the elites, that's just this core sort of strand of conspiracy theory, anti-institution, and then we get into this brew. And what's important, though, this is so you can tell there are like 6 things I mentioned, and they're loose. And at different points in time, people can accentuate one, talk about one, foreground it, background others, and it's loose. And that's part of the power. Is it's like Trump doesn't go against one single thing. He's got the slogan, and he'll just sort of invoke it as is, convenient. Maybe as an aside, well, anyways, for his charisma, which is part of that charismatic leader, I'll never forget being outside a rally. I didn't get into it because I didn't know at the time you have to arrive like 6 hours early at a Trump rally. I only arrived 3 hours early. This was the first one. Then I learned my lesson. I've been to a number since then. But I was there on the outside, and, all of a sudden I heard this strange chant, Genocide Joe. And I was like, that's really odd at a Trump rally, right? With the stance on Israel. And Trump, didn't bat an eye. He turned to the crowd and said, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. But just shows how he can, in the moment, take anything that's happening and sort of flip it over to his advantage. And so what's going to happen with Epstein files? He's going to flip it over to his advantage. He's done it over and over again. People continually underestimate him. Everybody, especially on the left, is looking for the fall of MAGA, the fall of Trump. Bad news for them. I don't see that coming.
How doesn't that happen? Because in the things that you talked about, all those pillars, the thing that does bind them together is this anti-deep state / elites conspiracy, right? Whether it is about the economy, whether it is about borders, whether it is about wars, whether it is about their feelings around who the Democrats are, and the us versus them thing for MAGA is this thing. How doesn't the fighting over releasing the Epstein files, how doesn't that damage MAGA at its core? Because even before the release of this stuff, because the fight to keep these things sealed felt really like it was the antithesis of what MAGA was at its center.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, as we speak, I think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, Trump tweeted a bunch of QAnon conspiracy memes, so he's just whipping it up, manipulating the situation. And it's clear that not all the files will be released. The ones that come out most likely will implicate Democrats. Others will be classified, protect victims' rights. They won't come out. So if Trump is named, I expect those to be tucked away. But you can't untuck a conspiracy theory, so it will keep going. But the bottom line is, there's obviously no Trumpism without Trump, and there's no MAGA without Trump. Everyone knows this. So if you're in MAGA, what are you going to do? You get rid of the charismatic leader. What are you left with? You're left with someone who's not charismatic. So J.D. Vance, who I've also seen live at rallies, he's smart, but he is not charismatic at all.
No. I've been at those rallies too. He doesn't have the juice. He doesn't have the same thing as when Trump walks out. The crowd doesn't feel that way. The room doesn't feel that way. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens after that. I do think it's interesting, this Trump's ability to make a loss a win, or to flip this kind of stuff. What do we know and understand about how social movements work that allow the charismatic leaders to do that? Because when you talk to people at MAGA rallies, at Trump rallies, they're by and large pretty normal people.
Absolutely.
Most of the time. They have regular jobs with kids and lives and all these things. And you would expect that they wouldn't want to be kind of taken for a ride in a lot of these ways. But how is it that in these social movements, people can just turn on a dime and not care about this thing that they did for 4 years, 5 years?
Yeah. And I think your comment makes the good point as well that, it's not as if Trump supporters are all MAGA. There's just a homogenous mass. Some people make the mistake of saying, oh, it's a giant cult, which is very reductive and don't know a lot about cult behavior when people sort of jump to that. But, so there are different gradations. And so we had these 6 different points I mentioned, and maybe one of the points is more important to a person, right? So maybe manufacturing jobs is the number one thing. It's interesting that when Trump met with Mamdani, a lot of people were surprised. I wasn't that surprised because actually Trump took a chunk of Bernie Sanders voters, right? He probably won the election with those voters in 2016. There was a study that came out that showed it was, over 5, 6, 7%, which is a huge number of voters flipped over. And Trump knows that, so he, in his own way, said, well, I like Bernie Sanders is good, Mamdani, whatever, because he doesn't want the Democrats to tap back into that. And he knows that's a threat. And so once again, people were confused, and it seems to grate with the sort of anti-communist part of MAGA, and it does, to be fair. But on the flip side, Trump can just take something and rework it to his advantage. But, never underestimate the importance of sort of working class voters that are part of MAGA, and they're, to them, again, those manufacturing jobs. I should note another thing in terms of emotion, right? And nativism, it's hard to also enter this notion. People sort of use that cliche, an epidemic of loneliness, but it speaks to a truth, right? You see studies that talk about it. Trump provides meaning. He makes people feel good. People identify with him. I mean, I've been, and it sounds like you have as well, to different contexts. People dress up. They're having a blast. At CPAC, for example, people dance in the aisles. They're just almost joyous. And I've been to Democratic events, and you do not have that. It's not like people are unhappy and crying, but there's something special about a Trump rally. And then he comes on, and just people go nuts. And I'm always sort of perplexed, maybe not that perplexed, when Democrats or Democratic-leaning media, sort of wonder, oh, Trump, he's losing it. He's boring. He's doing the weave. There's sections of his, they're saying a bunch of empty seats. Well, first of all, I've never seen any empty seats when I've gone. He packs the place, 20,000 people at a time. Part of his style is he goes and tells these long stories. He's sort of getting juiced up from the crowd. They're getting juiced up from him. But he lands at an end. And, that's the beauty for him and for the MAGA followers of what he does. Where do you land it? MAGA. It's like crystal clear. So it always is going to hit down on that point. And, the Democrats, if they have much of a chance, are going to need to do that. No, the one other, if we think of the drivers, you've got Trump, the boss. And I think what Marjorie Taylor Greene is sort of illustrated what I picked up in a lot of these gatherings of MAGA that I've been to. You don't cross the boss. You toe the line. You don't criticize the boss. Don't cross the boss. So, Trump is the boss, first and foremost. You have this nativist aspiration, again, and this goes back to the original inhabitants who aren't. This emerges in like the mid-1800s in the U.S., where you have the original inhabitants. Of course, are the settler colonials who are there, and then the Irish are suddenly invading, right? And the Pope has a conspiracy, and we'll go back to that conspiracy ideas. You have that, you have those pillars. And then we haven't touched upon another key thing, which is the media ecosystem, which drives this. Influencers, echo chambers, algorithms, far-right news, and, this stuff is just saturated. I heard at one point someone referred to it as marination. People are just marinating in this ecosystem, right? And getting ready to be juiced up at the rallies. MAGA, again, it's not going anywhere. They're hitched to Trump. It's going to continue as long as Trump's there. And once he goes, it will dissipate.
Let's drill down on some of the Epstein file stuff, because we kind of bounced off it a minute ago. But the way that I think this is going to roll out is that there are maybe like 3 different ways this happens. And let's go from least likely to I think most likely here. So the least likely is that we get a nearly fully unredacted minus like victim information or survivor information. We get 100,000 plus files from this DOJ investigation, almost entirely free for us to read. What happens to a MAGA movement then? Trump's implicated in those files is the assumption.
Yeah.
So what happens then?
Yeah, and maybe they've already leaked stuff, right? Like the drawing. So maybe some of the stuff has already purposely been sort of dribble it out bit by bit, and maybe that'll be the strategy. They're not going to release everything. There's absolutely going to be stuff held back. And again, it's like the JFK files. When you have stuff you hold back, the conspiracy theories keep going. But again, what Trump has done is he's pinning it on the Democrats. Right. So he's just flipped it around. I don't think that means everyone in, MAGA movement simply going to say, oh, Trump's not implicated. There's something about sex trafficking that hits, especially for like the evangelical Christians. A lot of the stuff about the border was about sex trafficking across the border. So there's like a point where if he ever got implicated, he would lose a chunk of followers. But I don't ever expect, even if that existed, I don't expect it ever to see the light of day. It'll just be redacted, crossed out. I'd be shocked unless someone somehow gets. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, like, because I think like the next thing is that it's mostly partially redacted, but it exonerates Trump, which I think is a win for MAGA, and they can kind of wash their hands of this thing and walk away and let whatever possible investigation about Bill Clinton or Larry Summers plays out in a way it does. But then I think the one that is actually most likely going to happen is we're going to get a lot of black bar pages that have a lot of pretty useless information to us. In what you just said is that the more that gets redacted, the longer this conspiracy is pulled out. Over time, and like maybe in short order in this term for Trump, do more and more MAGA people start falling away, both because of that conspiracy, but also because he's coming to the end of his time as president and leader of this movement? Yeah, I think that's a better way to think about it as opposed to like, oh, Marjorie Taylor Greene is gone. There's a huge split. No, she lost. She crossed the boss. She's out. And she had her own interest, right? Like she's looking ahead, probably playing the long game, though she certainly isn't charismatic in the way Trump is. So I don't expect her to go anywhere. Like Charlie Kirk was charismatic. When I thought of charismatic people on the right, he was another person that would come to mind. And obviously it was awful, his assassination. There really isn't anyone. She's not the person. But I think what you say is right. So assuming Trump doesn't run for a third term, and again, it is possible, then he's back again. Why would he? Well, I mean, again, we've got the files, though I really don't think I think it would have been released during the Biden administration if there was something that would hit Trump, like most likely. But Trump also, some of the cases can come back. People are going to dig into a lot of these corrupt deals that appear to be going on. There's a lot of graft. So Trump has a big interest in making sure that Republicans stay in power. Some people say the son will run. I've also seen him. He's not very charismatic either, though he does podcasting and different things, right? So he knows how to talk. Yeah. So
but I think that's different than being charismatic.
It is.
I mean, like I've seen him speak on stage too, and he doesn't quite have it. I think the person that I've only ever seen live who's come that close really was Barack Obama for sure.
Yeah.
And then maybe the Republican Party, like a 2015 Ted Cruz. But his rallies were way more like tent revivals than they were like Trump rallies. They were way more religious than they were like parties.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you on Obama. Ted Cruz, when I've seen him, is a little flat. Maybe I didn't see him back in 2015, so maybe he had something going back then.
He had some juice back then, but I don't think he's got it anymore.
He lost his juice.
But he grew the beard and lost the juice.
Yeah.
Is what happened. Yeah.
But going back to your, sort of that point, I think that's right. That people are going to start looking ahead, to the end of the term, lame duck status. Probably they'll lose the House. Things will be more difficult. But again, if he decides to rev it up and go on the trail, no one can turn on a crowd. Obama, as you point out, was the other person who really could do that. There's nothing. Trump's also at this point, I mean, he must be exhausted. I mean, it's astounding what he's able to do on the campaign trail at his age. So you've seen him, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, it's like 3 times a day, 20,000 people, an hour and a half with each crowd flying in between. And he does it day after day after day.
Yeah. And like I would say lately, it seems like that's catching up to him a little bit. And so I think also with that, some of the messaging you've seen from MAGA and that crowd has been a little less the physical prowess of Trump. You're seeing less and less of those like, trading cards of him as like a Arnold Schwarzenegger, looking guy. But I think that the charisma aspect is still there. I think the thing that's interesting, because we mentioned March of the Green earlier, is that in her resignation last week, she said something that was really interesting to me, is that she said that there is no plan to save the world. There's no 4D game of chess happening. Is that how these kinds of social movements die? They don't die with a bang. Generally, they sort of die as people kind of realize at the center of this, there's a lot of grift and graft, and they're the marks. Is that how this ends?
Yeah, it ends, again, we're sort of back to Trump because Trump can spin it, right? So what you're talking about is going on, right? If you just sort of peer, and that's what Marjorie Taylor Greene's upset about, right? We're back to sort of anti-globalization, elites, there are all these deals. I mean, Trump clearly wants to make a lot of money, and he wants to be adored, by the fact that every foreign leader has to send a message of adoration. So he'll act for, sort of his people who adore him, and he'll do some stuff. But yeah, has he delivered on the MAGA message? Of course not. Because in a way, it's an impossible message to deliver on. We're in a golden age suddenly, and well, we're not. So what are you going to do? Because people pretty quickly learn that all the promises can't be delivered, and so his popularity goes down. But again, I sort of come back to this. Trump, once he gets going and wants to whip up a controversy, whip something up to divert attention, as he's already doing now with the sedition, treason claims, right, against a number of Democrats, that's what he does. And he's really good at it. And but I think he's probably, like you said, getting a little tired and kind of exhausted. Age is catching up with him a little bit, but never underestimate Trump. That's another sort of bottom line that I think Democrats need to bear in mind.
So I know that MAGA ends after Trump because like there will be a post-Trump world. I think a lot of people who look at this kind of stuff from a political lens don't always get out of their own way and think about that. So what happens to then the policies of something like MAGA? What happens to the factions that are the Peter Thiel, Elon Musk factions versus the RFK Jr. factions versus the Stephen Miller factions, because they're all not exactly the same thing. Do they get folded into the broader Republican Party, kind of like the Tea Party movement, or do they split off? And are we going to get an America First Party in 2028?
Yeah, if there's an America First Party, it won't go too far. I don't think it's really hard to have a third party. But it's an interesting idea. I think actually Democrats most likely will be the ones to try and seize on the populism, even though they don't really have a charismatic leader. But they're back to Bernie, right? To the Bernie message, which they're starting to hit on a little bit. It's just such an obvious direction for them to go. I continually wonder, why don't they just hit that message over and over again? They're saying we're searching for a message. Well, there's an obvious thing to do. Go back and hit on that Bernie message. Maybe Mamdani will be a wake-up call in that regard, which isn't to say they should all become democratic socialists, but it's the idea of like, we're going to deliver for the people, right? On the ground, everyday Americans. That's the message. And that would reverberate widely. And they go back and get a lot of those old voters. One thing we haven't talked about at some point is the conspiracy theories, though, because really MAGA is like it's a brew of conspiracy theories that bubble up and float away. And that's why, you mentioned as well with Trump, it was really interesting. Again, you said you did the recent retweets he did of QAnon. And of course, in those, he was dressed up, right? Like in those. But it was interesting that he was going back to the deep state, which is where QAnon goes, right? As if he's got something in the works for that to signal Q. But that's just one. The conspiracies, deep state is always there, administered state, corrupt, evil, cabal, people, globalists, Jews, what have you. They're always there waiting to manipulate stuff. So you have this deep state stuff that's going on. You've got the big lie stuff, right? Stop the steal, big lie, corruption. That's another big one. Lawfare, which people don't sometimes forget, right? Like this was souped up during the last election. I went to a rally where Trump likened himself to Navalny, the Russian dissident, shortly after, right? He either was killed or committed suicide. And as you know from going to these rallies, how do they begin? They begin with the J6 choir, prison choir, cross-cut with him saying the pledge. Like this identification of this souped-up lawfare regime going against enemies. And so that's why people are saying, well, I can't believe Trump's doing this with the Democrats. Well, they think that was done to them. Fake news is another conspiracy. But again, in a lot of these, and then there are all the sort of roots and precursors, Obama, birther, lots of things about satanic forces. People wondered, why are people praying in the Capitol? Well, they're trying to purge demons from the Capitol. Like it's conspiracies of all sorts. COVID, Pizzagate actually is the one that really ties back into Epstein, right? Because you have someone, and in this case, even someone who's Jewish, right, going to all this sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, who's involved in sex trafficking. So here's this idea, and here's proof that it was happening. And the last one I probably should mention, linked to this, is sort of the replacement conspiracy theory, which as of today, when we're speaking, is either today or yesterday, right? You had a government meme saying basically a sort of replacement narrative, the demise of immigrants or the demise of Western civilization. So this one is it's always been there. It used to be no one, the Overton window hadn't shifted, to use that phrase that people talk about. Now the Overton.
I've used it before, but you go ahead and explain that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's the boundaries of acceptable discourse, basically. And so it's an intentional strategy that was done by people on the far right. Actually, Fuentes was someone who does this as well, where you say stuff, you may make jokes, as they call it, SHIT posting, whatever, to make things that are outrageous seem normal. And that's the goal. And then you shift that Overton window, and suddenly stuff that you couldn't say is now sayable, and it becomes more of the norm. So replacement discourse, which used to be cordoned off in sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory linked back to white genocide, neo-Nazis, KKK, and stuff like that, the sort of European version that seeped back to the U.S. after 2015. You remember those chants, "You will not replace us, but Jews will not replace us." And people are saying, what does this mean? That's a really weird thing. And now you say it, and everyone's like, oh, yeah, we know exactly what it is.
Right. What happens to, those things are going to be around no matter what, because conspiracies live and live in these spaces. But do those remain mainstream? Is there a way that the Overton window gets pulled back into a place where, Nazi slogans like "Jews will not replace us" aren't a common thing that people, are exposed to and understand and might agree with? Does that change in a post-Trump MAGA movement? Does that change?
Yeah, well, everything changes eventually and shifts back and forth, and but it's hard because of the sort of ecosystem that exists. And if you go against that in a very straightforward, direct way, we're back to that border principle, right? America first, then it's borders. And so, well, you're not for border security if you're saying we should let a bunch of quote unquote invaders come in that threaten our society. A lot of this is sort of implicit. And that's why it's nativism, right? Which is this, as I mentioned before, is this idea that the U.S. is being invaded by waves, and originally it was Irish, Italians, and went through all sorts of different ways of immigration. They're a threat to the body politic. You had the Know Nothing Party at one point that sort of, this was their plank, and it was back to America first and the plot, right? So it was the Irish are coming, and the Pope back in Rome, right? He's the one who's orchestrating it all. And it sounds weird. Some people say it sounds almost comical, but it's the same stuff just redone in the present.
Right. It's the same song and dance, the same thing. And I think it'll be really, really interesting to see what happens to sort of the witch's brew of all of those that we have right now in modern American politics on the American right, when MAGA sort of has to change and evolve into a place in which Donald Trump isn't, the president anymore. It'll be really fascinating.
Yeah. And, I was thinking, like, what happens to Laura Loomer?
Right.
She's going to fade away as well. She'll be out there. She's not going to have the amount of attention. So you're going to have all these people that are participating, like her Islamophobia that she pushes, as well. It's like I think people are so jaded at this point that they haven't really, or maybe there's just a large current of Islamophobia. But the stuff that's said on Twitter, X, by Loomer and a lot of other people, especially with Mamdani, is pretty shocking, actually. But people are more focused, I think, on anti-Semitism. But it's almost commonplace. Again, Overton window shifting, evil Islamic invasion, plays into some evangelical Christian second coming end times discourse as well. Back to Patrick Buchanan, right? Like, oh, the Taliban are going to be coming to your house. You better soup up and, get your compound wired, get your cameras, get your guns ready, because you may be in Detroit or anywhere and they can show up tomorrow.
Right. It's fascinating. The last thing I want to ask here, if I can keep you for like another 2 minutes, is what are you watching for as an anthropologist to happen, and as an anthropologist to happen next here? Because I think that's going to help other people know where to look.
Yeah, well, I guess, there are a couple of ways. I have a book called It Can Happen Here, which looks at a number of it sort of ranges all the way from, soft authoritarianism to atrocity crimes and even genocide. And it looks historically at the U.S. when this has all taken place before. People say, well, how could the U.S. be authoritarian? Well, look at like Jim Crow South and enslavement, right? I mean, there you go. You have a group of people who are held in authoritarian, even totalitarian circumstances. So it's the book sort of says it's happened before, it's happened, it'll happen again. But the other chunk of research I'm doing for a new book centers actually on sort of people overcoming the divisions. Because in fact, the divisions in this, social media ecosystem brew, it's all about dividing people. And if you actually look, people agree on tons of stuff. Go back to free speech. In fact, if I hit those pillars of MAGA and I took them out of MAGA and I reframed them slightly, and I went to a Democrat and said, what about free speech? Said, absolutely free speech. Should we prioritize the U.S.? Absolutely we should. Should we have secure borders? Oh, yeah, of course we should. There's just a ton of agreement, but, people lose sight of that. So I've been studying grassroots depolarization groups, for example, and sort of how they overcome the red-blue divide. And I have a book, it won't be titled This and Them, but it was sort of, why we're divided and how we reunite. That looks at this, but I'm also looking at how people are pushing back on sort of tendencies of soft authoritarianism. But, one of the things I've learned, and you've seen this too, is all the MAGA folk think that Democrats are a bunch of authoritarians. And in fact, they've already implemented an authoritarian regime. But when people aren't like you are, and I do, traversing between the two, they don't understand it. And so this is a long answer, sort of hitting it at the end. As an anthropologist, I'm curious myself to sort of learn to understand MAGA culture, if you will, to learn to speak MAGA, if you will. Like, that's my project. And then to translate that and explain it and sort of through books and writings to a broader public. So I'm not, sort of in the guessing game. But I'm already certain. I'm 98% certain that once Trump goes, the movement implodes. But then we're left with division. And so what's going to happen? And the good news in all this is, it's shocking. One I know is 2 minutes. I've gone past that. There's a grassroots depolarization group, bridging group called Urban Rural Action, who I've done work with. I remember talking to one woman. She has a MAGA cap, and she said, I came to the first event. And I thought someone was going to key my car, like, I don't know if people know this. You take a key, people will run it through while you're gone. And then it's like, oh, and I became best friends with all these people. You get people together, they interact, and all this stuff, for the most part, dissipates. So the good news is that there's sort of this bedrock of common shared values. And again, if people can sort of get away from that brew ecosystem and just have chances to talk to people who they think are very different, they'll quickly find there are other people like themselves. And, that's the future for the U.S. That's the good future if we go that direction. So we'll see. With AI, I'm a little bit nervous.
That is a different ball of wax. But Alex, thank you so much for coming on today and helping us speak MAGA, be our Rosetta Stone for speaking MAGA a little bit, if you will. I cannot wait to see what that next book is. I've got your actual book over here somewhere. But so thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and thanks for your show, and thanks for inviting me on.
I want to thank Alex again for coming on this show. You can find all of the links to his great work, both at Rutgers and at UNESCO, in the show notes for this episode. And that's it for this episode. Please rate and review the show, whatever podcast app you listen to it on. Like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. If you're a watcher on YouTube, leave a comment or a review wherever you're listening to this or watching it. It really helps boost the show on those platforms. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack. You can do that for free, but right now there is a subscription drive happening, $5 a month, $50 for the entire year. That is 20% off the monthly price. You get access to all sorts of original reporting every week, the Things You Forgot from Civics Class newsletter, the weekly wrap-up of all things MIM, Too Long Tuned Out, as well as all of the archives of all those articles and access to the community chat. If you don't want to do that, I totally get it. It's the holidays right now, but please make sure you're sharing the show on social media. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word, on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on Twitter and Blue Sky, and at Grant_Herms on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you next week.